the Code for Couples podcast, where our goal is to provide information and topics to keep our hometown heroes' relationships safe and code for. I'm your host, Cindy Doyle, LEO wife and licensed professional counselor. Today, we are going to talk about perspective taking and how that can benefit your relationship. One of the things that my husband constantly says, and we talk about this a lot, is the fact that having an understanding of each other's world is really important in this life, because without that, there can be a lot of conflict. I had a friend of mine, Ernesto, come into town. He owns a company called Filmit.com, and he was coming to film a promotional video for me for the Code for Couple site. And it was really interesting because we went up to the PD and we're playing around. He likes to get what he calls B-roll video. And so that is the background video. So it's not the person talking, it's the images that you see while the narrative is going on. And so he was getting this B-roll video, and one of the things that he wanted to get was like the light bars and then the gun, and then the guys just went crazy with him and just started showing him all these different things. They put a vest on him, and then they put, I don't even know what it's called, the other vest when like the crap hits the fan that you have to put on. And then they let him hold an AR. So they were like loading him down with the equipment, and then had him get in the car and showed him all the workings of it. But it was amazing to watch because he's always been a supporter of what I do and a supportive of police departments. But his face would just be like expression of, oh my gosh. And he was saying that, oh my gosh, all the time. So it was really cool to watch him grow in this appreciation for not just who they are and respect, but like a total appreciation of having to like run around. I think that's even one of the things that he said is like, y'all run around with this stuff on? And I kept saying, yeah, that doesn't even include the extra 15 pounds from the gun belt. So it was really cool to show this appreciation to see the appreciation of to see that he was growing in appreciation. And so that kind of made me think about the fact that we have to have a deep appreciation for each other's worlds, and that I've had my own journey to really understand my husband's world, and he's had to take some time to understand mine. Early on in our relationship, one of the things that I struggled with was the fact of being alone a lot. And here I was married, but didn't have anybody to go hang out with. And so those were one of the things that I would get kind of irritated, because when he was off, I wanted to go do something. Of course, he wanted to sleep. And so I would just get annoyed. And I think that it's easy to get annoyed at the little things and what we don't have and the adjustments that we have to constantly make. And it's easy to think about how it impacts us, but not to understand what the other person is feeling too. So one way to do that is through perspective taking. And so I'm going to focus on how to take the perspective of the other person today and how that can impact your relationship in a really positive way. One of the things what we first have to do is, like I said, kind of get outside of ourselves to be able to do that. But when you're experiencing the emotional pain and the irritation and the having different experiences, sometimes it's hard to get outside of ourselves. So it's easy to think about how we can be jealous of our friends doing various activities, that they have this quote unquote normal life that we see, kind of looking at social media and comparing ourselves to other people, thinking about how we're alone at those times, going to bed alone at night is a big one, how you're handling the kids all weekend long and you just don't get a break. One of the things that I hate the most is tiptoeing around all weekend. And while he's sleeping, I'm like supposed to be doing some kind of quiet activity, or I'm worried about the dogs barking and waking him up. And it just gets annoying. And so that gets kind of old and kind of grating upon us. And so it's easy to think about how it's impacting us, and not consider the other person. The other aspect to this that I kind of alluded to just a minute ago is comparison. Comparison, and I think I've said this before, Teddy Roosevelt he says that comparison is the thief of all happiness. Comparison is such a killer because, God, man, you look at social media and I look at families being together and, oh, we're out at the lake on the weekend, or, you know, they're doing something together as a family or with their spouse, or so that social media aspect can be a real killer. I kind of said, like, it gets me envious of other people, and that can kind of grate on me. And I think that comparison, we could spend a whole nother podcast on talking about comparison because it's such a big deal. So stay out of comparison, because that's a way that it prevents us from really understanding the other person's perspective. Staying out of guilt. This is something that I have heard from my LEOs and my first responders that I work with, is that they feel really guilty about their needs. So the fact that they need it to be quiet, the fact that they need to sleep, the fact that they're not there to help out, that they oftentimes feel guilty. So this isn't about guilt, and, you know, we get it. We understand what the career entails. It's just the considering the other person. We understand what the career entails. It's not that. It's not about the guilt. It's more about how we can share the burden together instead of just thinking that you need to take it all on. So comparison, staying out of guilt, and then also jealousy and thinking outside of ourselves are three things that we need to consider when we're looking at being able to take perspective. When we're in that mindset of protecting ourselves, it can be really difficult to have conversations, because what comes out, no matter how well we try to hide it, what happens is it kind of oozes out. It's like the green slime, if you will. So like this slime comes out in our conversation, and it might be just like your tone, it might be your facial expressions. And I kind of see that in sessions sometimes where people roll their eyes, or they kind of like, oh, right. And so it can ooze out. So having those aspects in your relationship, while you think you're hiding it, you're probably not doing a good job. Not being able to take the perspectives of somebody else can lead to defensiveness, and you can kind of feel criticized a lot when somebody is trying to talk to you about their needs. Sometimes it's like, oh, well, I'd really like your help with the kids, or I really need some help with the chores. And it's like, well, I can't help it that I need to sleep, or I need it to be quiet. Well, I can't help that the kids make noise. Those kinds of things lead to arguments and hurt and just more poison within your relationship. So part of perspective taking is your ability to empathize. Empathy is different than sympathy. Sympathy is feeling for someone, and empathy is feeling with someone. So when you're thinking about sympathy, being in the South, we do the whole bless your heart a lot. So bless your heart isn't always a bad thing. Like sometimes we're really like, oh my gosh, that's really difficult. But sometimes, we use it for like, oh, poor you. Anyway. So sympathy is feeling for someone. So like, oh, I feel so sorry for him because he doesn't have time with the kids. Empathy is feeling with someone. So it's like, wow, that's really hard. You're missing out on some things. So we're looking for empathy rather than sympathy. You use empathy to connect And empathy ultimately gives you greater intimacy and connection. And yes, that does mean sexual connection. So maybe I got your attention now, guys. So it works best to be able to have perspective taking when both parties are willing to do this. It makes it hard if it's just one-sided, because if it's just one-sided, like I'm always giving you the perspective, but then you don't have that consideration for me. So if you're wanting to build that connection and really use perspective taking in a positive way, both parties have to do it. So I'm going to encourage you to think about that. So think about this. If you are a spouse of an officer or a first responder, you have to think about how your spouse feels. So in this case, my husband and I were talking on the porch because he's always talking about, man, and just consideration of perspective. And we do this really well at this point, but he was talking to me about Christmas. And I was saying, oh yeah, you know, that sucks. And we were talking about it. He started to share with me and he said, you know what's worse? It's not Christmas Day for me. It is sitting in a patrol car on Christmas Eve when you're sitting there at night and you're looking at the Christmas lights and all you're thinking about is how people are being with their families and how they're going to wake up Christmas morning and open presents. And that's when it's bad. And I thought, wow. And just now, like when I'm talking about it, like I'm getting emotional just thinking about it because I think about the loneliness involved. And while I always knew holidays were hard, he told me probably 2 years ago now. Now, once again, we've been married for 17 years and he's been in the field that long. Just 2 years ago, he said to me, please don't ever let me spend a holiday alone. And I said, okay. No more. I won't do it. I won't go because in the past I would go to my family's because he was working. And it was just an agreement we had. And at this point in time in his life, he's like, I don't want to do that anymore. So anyway, keeping the perspective as far as where he's coming from. So Christmas Eve was something that was big for him, and he shared that story. Also from the spouse perspective, considering what it's like for him, you know, at least for me, the inability to relax. So when he's on shift, he cannot relax. And this is something that when I was talking to Ernesto, I had to help him understand. Like, it's constant scanning. And you know what it's like if it's a spouse, if you're a spouse, because you deal with it. Like all the other times, like he's just constantly scanning when he's on shift. Or heck, when you go out, he's probably doing it in that OODA loop, which, you know, we've talked about before, constantly in crowds. But while it can be really annoying as a spouse, like having that, being able to see through their eyes and say, you know, okay, I get it. It's hard to turn off. And not everybody's like that. I know officers that don't carry off duty. I know officers that can totally relax, but with mine, he does a lot of OODA looping when we're in large crowds. And part of that is that we both have some anxiety in regard to crowds and things like that. So, you know, the other thing that I had thought about as a spouse is what's it like for him to not have quote unquote normal hours? I mean, that's something that as a spouse, I can be like, God, it's so annoying. But at the same time, what's it like for him not to have those normal hours and to be able to be up when the sun's up or when the rest of the world is awake? What's it like for him when he's off one day and has to stay on those deep night hours and be up in the middle of the night, but not make noise because we're sleeping? You know, it's sometimes the grocery stores are open, maybe they could do something, but a lot of times there's just not much to do. So having that consideration, and also time missed with the family. I know as spouses, a lot of times we're really bummed out at the time that we're missing with them, but also the time that they're missing with you or the kids, and what that feels like. Maybe even with their parents or their extended family, that they would like to be having that time. So it's important to keep that perspective in mind. Now, if you're a LEO or a first responder, there's some things that you can probably consider. One of the things is considering what it feels like to be alone. Specifically, maybe even to be alone at social events. One of the things that I had to do a lot was, there was this ongoing joke of, oh, does your husband even really exist? And I wanted to say all kinds of foul things, but I have a better mouth than that, so I don't. But that, ongoing joke. We're not talking like once or twice. We're talking for years. I would hear that. I'm like, that's so funny. No, it's not. So thinking about what it's like, not just like, oh, I'm so alone, but going to these social events and having go, yeah, he's on shift, and people really not understanding that world and the accommodations you make or that your spouse makes to be a part of that world. Once again, this isn't about feeling guilty about it. It's just simply the perspective of what that's like to understand. What's it like for your spouse to be totally responsible for the kids or the household or whatever it is on the weekend? I talk to a lot of spouses in which they have to take care of the kids on the weekend because their LEO is on a shift. And so one of the things, it's that tiptoeing around thing. Like, the kids want to be kids, and you do the best you can to keep them quiet or go out and do something, but they're kids, so they're going to cry, they're going to scream, you can't control them. And so while it can be annoying, you're like, why can't the kids just be quiet? It's also that understanding that they're doing the best they can. Trust me, we're not doing it on purpose, that you trying to stir things up and make it noise or let the dog bark or let the kids scream and cry. That's not the point. So and the other thing, as a LEO, you might consider, what's it like for you not to be present all the time? There are times when you're going to be preoccupied, whether there's something going on at work, there's a possibility you might be called in, you're needing to decompress, you're just not able to be there emotionally and or physically. And so, more emotionally, I guess, at this point, but you're not able to be present in whatever's going on. And so what's that like for your spouse? Once again, not like I need to feel guilty or I need to feel defensive, but really just having a perspective taking. What would that feel like to have you physically there, but not really there, not engaged? So it's really important that both parties, I've said that like 3 times now. Do you get that? That's important. It's really important that both parties do this perspective taking, because it's going to, if I'm able to have your perspective and you're able to have mine, then we start to have a new synergy and a new flow to our relationship. So then it can impact things like how I interpret what you're saying to me. Because maybe you're tired and I know you're tired and you say something that's maybe a little sharp. But hey, I'm like, you know what? She's been kind of cooped up all weekend and maybe that's why she's being a little short. Or gosh, it's 100 degrees outside and he's been in a car in and out and he's got a vest on. He's probably hot and just kind of overwhelmed. So I can have a positive interpretation to that situation, and that way I don't react. And so in that, I can have that different perspective, and it really helps. It also helps to interpret behavior, so not just what you say, but what you do. I can be more compassionate for your frustration, because I can see where your frustration might stem from. And heck, maybe it's not me, because the world doesn't revolve around me. It's not about you. Sometimes it just is. So instead of thinking about me and how it's impacting me, I can think about maybe where that comes from you and your perspective. And that might also motivate me to have a different behavior on your part or on my part. So if I know that during the week or during the weekend, you need to stay quiet and you have the kids, I might think, maybe I can vacuum during the week because that's noisy and I'm awake right now and nobody else is home, or this is a time that it's available to do that. Okay, sidebar. So I really hate doing housework at 7 o'clock at night, and I have done it off and on for years. So I'm sure some of you have too. So how awesome would it be if your spouse could have that perspective and go, that's something she has to deal with. I'm going to vacuum. So it can change not only the way you think about things, but the way you behave. So as I said, doing that on both sides really kind of changes the flow of the relationship. That doesn't mean like every now and then we don't have total meltdowns because we want our world to be a totally different way. But, maybe our partner can have some perspective of why we're melting down. And maybe you can work to, as a partner, understand where that's coming from and not get so defensive or critical. And walk into having some empathy and understanding to the meltdown as opposed to, oh my gosh. So saying something like, yeah, I get it. I feel that way sometimes too. Sometimes that's all you need to say. Sometimes it's just like, this is hard sometimes. You don't have to have many other words than that to let people know that you understand where they're coming from. So hopefully this was helpful information. I really encourage you to get curious about each other's perspectives and have some conversations around maybe some of the bigger issues or some of the things that you don't really understand. And really, I say that a lot, just get curious. Ask some how questions. Don't ask why. That's a big one. Stay away from why questions, or you can put that in a way where it's like, tell me more about this. Yes, that sounds very counselorish, but I'm telling you, it's a great way to open up conversation. So get curious about that. Let me know what perspectives you struggle to take in your life or with your spouse. Or if this was helpful in any kind of way. You can get in contact with me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. I would absolutely love for you to subscribe to the podcast. That would mean the world to me. And what would be even better, like the best compliment that you can give to me, is that you would share it with other people that would find it helpful. That would be amazing. If you would like a transcript to the podcast, it will be available on my website. I really thank you for joining me and listening. And until next time, keep your relationship code 4.